For our meditation today, I'd like to share an excerpt from an article written by Mark Twain about how to tell a humorous story. There are several kinds of stories, but only one difficult kind, the humorous. I'll talk mainly about that one. The humorous story is American, the comic story is English, the witty story is French. The humorous story depends for its effect upon the manner of the telling, the comic story and the witty story upon the matter. The humorous story is strictly a work of art, high and delicate art, and only an artist can tell it. But no art is necessary in telling the comic and the witty story. Anybody can do it. The art of telling a humorous story, understand, by word of mouth, not print, was created in America and has remained at home. The humorous story is told gravely. The teller does his best to conceal the fact that he even dimly suspects that there is anything funny about it. But the teller of the comic story tells you beforehand that it is one of the funniest things he's ever heard, then tells it with eager delight and is the first person to laugh when he gets through. And sometimes, if he has a good success, he's so glad and happy that he will repeat the nub of it and glance around from face to face, collecting applause, and then repeat it again. It's a pathetic thing to see. And all of which is very depressing and makes one want to renounce joking and lead a better life. And let's take a moment of silence. I want to tell you a story today with some interesting characters. I'll include 6 chapters, but first, let's begin with the prologue. Philip Pullman, author of The Golden Compass, among other books, said, "After nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in this world." I believe that Pullman is mostly correct in his thinking. However, I think stories do have the ability to create a sort of companionship. I remember as a child falling asleep while listening to my Teddy Ruxpin as he took me on a hot air balloon ride. I didn't feel frightened or alone as I sometimes did when the lights went out, but safe and happy to be with a friend. When I grew, I felt as though I really had a relationship with the characters from my favorite series, The Babysitter's Club. So I just aged myself. And as I finished The Old Man and the Sea for the first time in college, I felt warm, like I'd been basking in the sun while listening to the story as it was told by an old friend. I think only the best books make us feel this way, as though we are being companioned. And while I think Pullman was referring only to books, when listing the need for stories, it applies just as well, if not better, to verbal storytelling. No matter how wonderful a book is, it cannot replace the intimacy that is created between two people when sharing a story face to face. One of my major tasks as a hospital chaplain, and personally my favorite part of the job, is to facilitate life review, which is just a way to say that I create a space where people feel safe enough to tell me their stories. All day long, I listen to stories. Sometimes it's family members speaking for the patients, and sometimes it is the patients themselves. Sometimes I hear confessions, I hear secrets, I hear regrets, and I'm certain that from time to time I hear lies and exaggerations. The truth is, though, it matters less to me that I'm lied to than it does to understand how the lie informs me of the person telling it. It's part of the story, perhaps even adding depth and layers to it, and I am the listener, invested but non-judgmental and unattached to the outcome. In all my listening, I have learned that human beings tell stories for many reasons. We use stories to sway someone's opinion of us, to entertain others, to feel a part of something, to relieve a stress or anxiety, or to verbally process an event. Some people tell stories to leave a piece of themselves with the listener, and some find that sharing their story bolsters their own self-image. And sometimes telling stories heals us. Chapter 1, Storytelling Techniques. If we look to the world's religions, Each has been calculably created in beautiful, epic story form. For example, Buddhism utilizes the traditional storytelling technique of including vibrant and fantastical imagery. Think of the Buddha having just been born under the branches of the beautifully symmetric Bodhi tree, standing, speaking in full sentences, and leaving lotus blossoms in the place of each footstep. And we see the technique of repetition of hard-to-remember facts in the book of Genesis, chapter 5, rhythmic and tedious genealogy of Noah. Another technique we see prominently displayed in the Hebrew Bible is that of creating relatable characters. Think of Job, a literal everyman, down and out, full of suffering and questions. I think we can all relate to him in one way or another. We also see foreshadowing, hyper-emotional language, symbology, numerology, and narrative arcs of conflict and resolution. Even for those completely unfamiliar with religious texts, this use of storytelling techniques should not seem surprising. Communicating something as important as a religion's origins and a family's heritage had to be done in a way that would be engaging, exciting, and easy to remember, as well as recommunicate, thus making it possible to share the stories as efficiently as possible. It was also important to assure these histories were accessible to each person in a time when viable systems of writing had not yet been created, and then into the period when the written word was controlled by the elite. Today, our eyes lay upon words and stories in even the most unusual places. Chapter 2, Skin Writing. Fun fact, I have 6 tattoos. I'll save you the details, but my tattoos tell a story about my spiritual journey. They provide a map of symbols identifying who I was, what was important to me, and what I found beautiful at certain moments in my life. For some, tattoo artists are the illustrators of the story of our lives, and our skin is their canvas. Some of us choose to keep our stories for only those with whom we can trust them. However, those with tattoos seem to prefer to make their story available to anyone and everyone, in some cases even literally wearing it on their sleeves. My dear friend Chris Stedman, interfaith activist, humanist chaplain at Yale, and author of the book Faith Theist, finds that storytelling is the most powerful way to humanize someone who is not like you. He tells the story of one of his innumerable tattoos, an artist's rendering of Abraham Lincoln's profile in an article for the Huffington Post. He writes, "I cherish all of them, my tattoos. I've even come to appreciate the one with the Bible verse that I got shortly before I stopped believing in God. But I was particularly excited about this new one for 2 reasons. It marked the completion of my right arm sleeve, and it's an acknowledgement of the work I've dedicated myself to. We all bear the mark of the history that precedes us. I've just made this mark literal. This ink will always be a part of me. To me, this tattoo is a stake in the ground, a permanent nod to the public and personal gravity of cultivating productive and respectful relationships across lines of religious differences." He goes on, "I hope that people will continue to ask about the tattoo and that it will engender dialogue. For Chris, his tattoos serve as a conversation starter, an intentional way to engage people who may be different than he is theologically, or to encourage them to wonder about his story, thus humanizing him. For him, it's a practical application of the power of storytelling. While Chris is very aware of the story he is telling with his tattoos, there are many ways in which we are sometimes not aware of how or why we share our stories." Chapter 3. Wait, this isn't tofu? In the movie I Heart Huckbees, the character of Brad, an ambitious advertising executive, tells a story over and over again about secretly feeding Shania Twain a chicken salad sandwich after she expressly states she doesn't eat mayonnaise. Each time he tells it, he laughs at the part where he tells her he deceived her. Eventually, he's retold the story by someone who had witnessed him telling it many times. But this time, he's reminded of the real ending, that actually Shania Twain is a vegetarian, and that's why she didn't like the chicken salad sandwiches. Brad is shocked. As the witness explains his need to have people think he is clever and important, motivates his continued telling of the story. You see, Brad had changed the story and told it so many times that his imagined version became his real version. And when he needed to impress someone, or when he was feeling particularly insecure, he pulled the Shania story out of his pocket as a secret weapon. We all have a Brad in our lives. Maybe it's someone who constantly updates his or her Facebook status, declaring how awesome he or she is at their job or life in general, not realizing that, in fact, it paints the very opposite image of them in our minds. It's okay to have a little bit of Brad in ourselves as well, because although it's not always effective, all Brad is a caricature of someone who takes advantage of the influence of storytelling, and indeed, that is an important skill to have. Often telling a story is more about connecting with another human being than it is just about conscious or unconscious manipulation of them. It's freeing to share our story with someone who's really listening. It's emotional to hear them acknowledge our struggles and our triumphs. In this way, good storytelling binds us to one another, reminds us we're not alone in this journey of life, and provides us with a sense of peace, clarifying this information that divides us, or knowing that our story does not die with us. Chapter 4, Remembering is a Holy Thing. These last two reasons, clarification and legacy, are the theme of the book entitled The Red Tent. In Anita Diamant's book, we read the story of Dinah, a character we learn of in Genesis who's referred to only once after a violent attack. In the Hebrew Bible, Dinah is spoken of only secondary to the vengeance her brothers take on her attacker. In Diamant's book, however, Dinah is the main character, the narrator of the story actually, and the entire book is the author's imagined story of Dinah's life, from birth to death and old age. In Genesis, it was the sons that carried the lineage, but in the Red Tent, it is the daughters who carry the stories. In the prologue, Dinah says, "I wish I had more to tell of my grandmothers. It's terrible how much has been forgotten, which is why I suppose remembering is a holy thing." In the story, Dinah, having been born into a family with 4 mothers, knows from an early age that it is her duty as a daughter to learn the stories of her mothers. This was not unique to Dinah's family, but was the reason that baby girls were treasures to their mothers. Diamant writes in Dinah's voice, "The other reason women wanted daughters was to keep their memories alive. If you want to know any woman," Dinah says, "you must first ask about her mother, and then listen carefully." Dinah knows that she must carry the legacy of her mothers with her and share them with her own children, keeping them, in her own words, immortal. But also she understands that her mother's stories are a vitally important part of her own story. Again and again in the Red Tent, she shares her gratitude for the reader's attention. For Dinah, and I think for each of us, it's an act of love to listen to the stories of others and to acknowledge and affirm them in return. Doing so creates what is perhaps the most important use of storytelling: healing. Chapter 5, Smothered, Covered, and Diced. Last Monday, I found myself at a rundown Waffle House on the side of a random 2-lane highway in Alabama with a cranky 2-year-old and a hangry partner. After finishing every delicious bite of hash browns, smothered, covered, and diced as always, I overheard our waitress mention to another customer that she was turning 25 the following week. I glanced to her name tag and saw in tiny print towards the bottom it read, "Team member since 2008. I crunched the numbers, which you all know is a feat for me, and was surprised to learn that she'd likely begun working at this restaurant between the ages of 18 and 19. I wondered why she'd stayed there amidst the grease-stained walls and sticky countertops. Then a funny thing happened. This young woman, who by all accounts seemed full of energy, was kind, hardworking, and incredibly personable. The type of young person I imagined succeeding easily in whichever career she chose, proceeded to tell her story to the other customer, and that no, in fact, she'd not be spending her birthday with family, as the customer assumed. She'd be working because, you see, she was estranged from her two brothers. Her father had died when she was only a child, and her mother, whom she called her best friend, died when the waitress was 18. She explained that prior to her mother's death, she had been her caretaker, bringing her to dialysis 3 times a week, cooking and cleaning for her all by herself. Realizing that in all likelihood this young woman came to work at Waffle House and stayed working at Waffle House simply because she had to. I admit I thank the universe for the reminder that people are always more complex than we imagine. But after reflecting on this experience, I realized that this young woman could have chosen to answer her customer's question with a simple no, or I'll be working. But instead, she shared a bit more of herself. Why do you think she did this? Without knowing for sure, I imagined it was a part of her grief process. In fact, one counseling theory states that after a trauma occurs, a person must tell the story over and over and over again, sometimes over the course of many years. First, they include the minutest details until slowly those details fade and the overall event becomes integrated into their personhood. In other words, they tell the story until it makes sense, until they find meaning in it, and from there, the theory states, they can move forward. Chapter 6, From I to We. There's an African proverb that states, until the lion tells the side of the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. This proverb reminds us that there are always 2 sides to each story, and that the power dynamic between those 2 sides is immensely important to the shaping and understanding of how a story will be remembered in history. Much like our story that was presented today to the children. Typically, it is the person with the most power whose side of the story is remembered. I had the pleasure to study under Michael Jackson, not the one you think. That would have been amazing. But actually, it was the founder of existential anthropology, which is just as interesting and complex as it sounds, by the way. Jackson spent many years in the field studying the stories of the Australian Aboriginals and remote tribes in Sierra Leone and the Cape York Peninsula. His most important work is that on the politics of storytelling, the title of one of his books. In it, he discusses the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, writing, in the hearings, Archbishop Desmond Tutu invoked the African concept of Ubuntu to argue that reconciliation requires a movement from I to we. The ghastly stories of the apartheid era have value, not in absolving individual guilt, but in healing a damaged nation through a piacular ritual that, as Belinda Bozzoli notes, replaces individual representations with collective beliefs and recasts personal stories in ways that makes them emblematic for all who suffered. In helping stories and lives carry meanings beyond the personal, the TRC worked to reconcile different people to one another as members of a single commonwealth of humanity. In other words, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee used the ritual of storytelling as a way to create a shared experience of suffering for both blacks and whites. It was the first step of redistributing the power and finally hearing the lion's side of the story. And interestingly enough, many scholars have credited the structure of storytelling presented by the TRC as enabling South Africa to move forward from the systematic evil of racism at a quicker rate than both the United States and Australia. Epilogue. Like my tattooed friend Chris, we all have a story we choose to share. What's your story? And with whom do you feel safe enough to share it? Like Brad from I Heart Huckabees, oftentimes there are reasons we tell our stories that even we don't understand. but rather rely on someone else to tell us what it all means. Who is that person for you? Like the young waitress from Waffle House, sometimes we have a story we must share over and over again until it becomes a part of who we are, until it becomes a chapter in our very thick book. Which chapter are you working on now, and what do you think its title is? And lastly, like Dina from the Red Tent, we carry inside of us the stories of every person we meet. There are a million pages of triumph, loss, love, and life residing in our hearts and in our minds. It's beautiful to think of how they connect us to one another, and it's humbling to consider the power that lay in storytelling. We have the power to share our story or keep it to ourselves, the power to listen to the stories of others, to stay stagnant and unmoved by them, or to learn from them and let them transform us. What's your choice? We've spoken on how to tell a story. I'll leave you with these words from Rachel Naomi Remen on listening. Perhaps the most important thing we bring to another person is the silence in us. Not the sort of silence that is filled with unspoken criticism or hard withdrawal. The sort of silence that is a place of refuge, of rest, of acceptance of someone as they are. We are all hungry for this other silence. It is hard to find. In its presence, we can remember something beyond the moment, a strength on which to build a life. Silence is a place of great power and healing. Service is over. Let the fellowship continue, and go in peace.